from Brunel Pension Partnership here with us today as our keynote speaker and giving us the speech on the Asset Owner Diversity Charter. Afterwards, we will have a short introduction of executive on who we are and what we value, in addition to our recently launched executive.com and giving a sneak peek of its unique executive diversity data features. The rest of the conference will comprise 4 respective panels, which will be Diversity and Inclusion, Asset Manager and Diversity, Asset Owner and Diversity, and Leadership and Chief Diversity Officers. Finally, we will end on a closing statement.
Additionally, throughout the event, you will be able to submit questions for either all the panelists or a specific person. Just please indicate whom your question is for in the chat. To submit a question, please feel free to leave a comment in the chat feature below, and our moderator will pick as many from there during the Q&A sections as time will allow. That said, we are going to save the last 10 minutes of each panel to go through and answer as many questions as we can. To help everyone better focus on what our speakers want to share, please stay muted with your webcams off throughout the whole event to ensure there are no interruptions.
Yeah, and finally, we want to say we are really looking forward to our first virtual Executive Diversity and Inclusion Conference. Let's welcome our keynote speaker, Helen Price, who, in addition to being co-chair of the Asset Owner Diversity Charter, is also leading on stewardship, engagement, and voting at Brunel Pension Partnership. Andreas, would you like to give us an introduction on Helen?
Yes, thank you very much, Scott and Wendy.
Yeah.
So it's my greatest pleasure to introduce Helen Price, who will give us the keynote on the Asset Owner Diversity Charter, which can make quite a difference to gender and ethnic diversity in asset management over time. I understand from Helen there is an extensive survey that is currently being mailed out via various platforms to pretty much any asset manager. And so, Helen, over to you. Looking forward to your keynote. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Andreas and Wendy and Scott. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss this really important topic, diversity and inclusion, and also to share details with you about the Asset Owner Diversity Charter. Before I do that, a background to myself. I've been working for Brunel Pension Partnership for the past 4 years, and previously the Avon Pension Fund. I oversee the engagement and voting in the companies that we own, and also lead on our diversity and inclusion work. Before I jump into the charter, I thought it would be a good opportunity to have a reflection on what the current state of play is with diversity and inclusion across companies, primarily with a focus on the UK. Diversity and inclusion isn't something new. There's been serious inequalities, and a lack of inclusion between different groups has been present in our society for many years. Recent events and the impact of the pandemic have certainly brought this front and centre, and there's increased focus and attention on this topic now, which is great to see. Investors, regulators, customers and employees are all demanding more change from their companies, and diversity and inclusion is no longer something that companies and society can ignore or just play lip service to. I mentioned that this isn't a new area. Research has shown the evidence of correlations between diversity and inclusion and positive outcomes in not only performance, but risk management, good conduct, healthy working culture and innovation. And there have been initiatives in place for quite a few years now to seek improvement. Often, these initiatives are focused at the board level. The most noticeable in the UK are the Hampton-Alexander Review, which made a recommendation for FTSE 100 and FTSE 250 boards to have 33% female representation. And the Parker Review, which made a recommendation for the same boards to have at least one director of colour by 2021. And progress is slowly being made. Spencer Stuart recently put out their 2021 board index analysis, and it's reported that now women represent 51% of non-executive directors in the top 150 boards in the UK. This is the first time that they've formed the majority. 15 boards have now reached gender parity, and that's 5 more than 2020. and 61% of FTSE boards now have at least one director from a minority ethnic background. Now, this progress is great to see. However, there are only 14 female chairs. Only 14% of executive directors are female, and there's been no improvement since 2020. And men hold all 4 positions of chair, CEO, CFO, and SID in 64 of the top 150 companies. Now, arguably, the top executive roles, the board leadership, tend to be those that make the most decisions. And these are the positions that are now lagging the non-executive directors. So we also need to see improvement here for sustained noticeable change. Whilst I agree that diversity at board level is important, it's where the ownership lies. The board only forms a small proportion of the decision making at a company. The executive committees and beyond all play a role in implementing the strategic direction of the company and all contribute to the company's culture or inclusion. I think it's everyone's responsibility within organisation to own diversity and inclusion and ensure that a culture is fostered where everybody can contribute to good decision making. So we've got information on the company boards. What about the executive committees? How are they faring? Unfortunately, progress here is not as great. 24% of ExCo members are women. Only a quarter have reached the 33% Hampton Alexander target, and 90% of ExCos are still all male. As I mentioned, whilst we're seeing the improvement, we need the improvement to go throughout the organisation all the way through. Now, as an investor, our activities have also tended to focus at board level. Investors across the investment industry are now targeting voting at executive level as well, but data disclosure tends to be a problem and access to data is difficult for us. Transparency and disclosure is often a barrier that's cited in the area, and it's something that's coming under increased focus. A lot of discussion papers and consultations that we've seen over the past year from regulators are starting to focus on this, and we're starting to see some change coming through that will require better disclosure from companies. I must also add that there are some companies out there as well that have also started to voluntarily disclose this data because they're seeing the importance not only from an external perspective, but internally in how they manage their workforce and how they foster and create a better inclusive environment. Now, I was invited here today to talk to you about the Asset Owner Diversity Charter. So before I give you some information on that, I just wanted to highlight why diversity and inclusion is important to not only myself, but also the organisation that I work for. From a personal perspective, I'm a female, clearly have a regional accent, and I was the first in my family to go to university. I've been working in the investment industry for the past 6 years. Previous to this, it was unknown to me. I didn't know a lot about the industry. Many of my family weren't really exposed to it. It was all sort of alien to me, and I was encouraged to apply for a role, and I'm certainly glad that I was and that I got the job. I feel truly privileged to work in this industry in a role where there's the opportunity to expand my horizons and work with like-minded individuals who are all seeking to make an impact and positive change. So I feel that I have a responsibility in my role to ensure that others from different diverse backgrounds also have the same opportunity. Now, I previously mentioned that I'm head of stewardship at Brunel. So at Brunel, we represent the investments, £35 billion of investments of 10 like-minded pension funds. So it's our fiduciary responsibility to ensure that their pensions are there, ready for them when they come to retire. But more than that, Brunel believes in creating a future that's worthwhile living in. So we are all about responsible investment and embedding it into everything that we do. We outsource our investment at Brunel, so we appoint asset managers to invest on our behalf. Now, if we think that diversity and inclusion at company level is bad, in the investments industry, it's even worse. It's the worst performing industry in the UK versus others on diversity. In the past year, they now have the worst gender pay gap. Representation is quite poor in the investment industry. Now, that's not to say there haven't been some initiatives to try and improve that, and there's been some great ones over the past year, such as the 1,000 Black Interns, the Women in Finance Charter, but progress has been painfully slow. And as an asset owner, we have a responsibility to hold our asset managers to account, and we haven't been doing that when it comes to diversity. So back a year and a half ago, a group of asset owners came together to discuss our approach to diversity and inclusion with our managers. And whilst some of us were asking questions during selection and sort of annually, it became apparent that our approaches differed and that there was more that we could be doing. So we came together and decided, discussed the approach and formed a working group. So this is made up of representatives of UK asset owners, from Lothian Pension Fund to Nest, Railpen, Brunel, and a couple of others, shared our approach, and we developed the Asset Owner Diversity Charter. So what is this charter? It has 3 core asks of signatories. The first is that signatories commit to including diversity and inclusion within their manager selection process, and this means ensuring that it forms part of the scored criteria. The second is including it into manager monitoring on an ongoing basis, and as part of this, we've developed a questionnaire that signatories commit to sending out annually to their managers. I'll provide a bit more detail on that questionnaire in a moment. And then the third area is leadership and collaboration. So it's about getting more asset owners talking about diversity, assessing how this interplays with not only the selection of investment managers, but the companies that we're investing in. And one of the other key asks that we implement as part of the manager selection is that signatories put it into their investment management agreements with their manager that we need disclosure on an annual basis. There isn't a lot of transparency in the investment industry, and it's really quite difficult to even ascertain at an industry level the number of Black portfolio managers or the number of female fund managers and the money that's being run by them. So we do need greater transparency there. We launched the charter in August this year with 17 signatories representing over £1 trillion in assets, which we were really pleased with. And we've since added an additional 2 signatories since launch and continue to work with others to build on that. Now, I mentioned one of the key components of the charter is the questionnaire. So data disclosure is really important, and I felt it was important that we moved beyond existing initiatives that just look at the board level and the strategy to understand the organisation's approach throughout their workforce. So we split the questionnaire into 2 core components. The first area is a quantitative section, and the second is qualitative. The reason that we decided to do this is we are surveying managers across the UK, Europe, US, globally, and approaches differ and firm size differ. So we needed to provide an opportunity to look at the data, but also the story behind what are the firms actually doing, what are their strategies and policies and processes in place to better understand the data. We can't just look at the data on its own. We road tested the questionnaire in January last year with a group of asset managers, with peers across the industry and other experts for some input on what data might be available and what was possible. And really to ascertain whether the questions we were asking were the right questions or there were any areas that we were missing. And one thing that actually came through on that and that we do include in the questionnaire now was around sort of mental health and well-being. That's an area that's sort of increased in awareness as well over the past year. And many of the respondents felt that was something that should be included as part of the approach firms are taking. We were then put in contact, we work quite closely with the Diversity Project. So they're a sort of leading organisation across the investments industry that bring together different representatives from asset management firms. And they have lots of different work streams working on lots of different areas. And they put us in contact with a consultants group who were starting to do some work on this. And they felt that the questionnaire and the work that we were doing would be relevant to share. So we agreed to share the questionnaire and the findings of the road test with them, and collectively as a group, along with camera data and eVestment, worked through the questionnaire question by question and really asked ourselves, what is it we want to know and why? And are we asking this question in the appropriate manner? We were quite conscious. We didn't want to be leading with our questions. We didn't want it to come across as they were saying, you must do this, you need to do that. Instead, we wanted to sort of get the organic information out of managers as to what they felt was the best approach and how they were using the information they were collecting. We, on the questionnaire on the qualitative section, we asked for a number of metrics, and we wanted to ensure that this was much greater than just focuses on gender, which again is often something that happens in the past, gender and everything else. So we ask for data on gender and ethnicity, and we also ask managers if they are collecting information on socioeconomic background, sexuality, disability, that they provide the categories that they're using in the information. And in the future, we can use that to improve the questionnaire, create greater standardization and embed that into it. We also felt it was important to have cross-sectionality. So often some of the past questionnaires that have gone out have focused on just asking for the data on one level. So can you tell me the number of females that are in your firm? Can you tell me the number of Black people in your firm? Rather than asking that at a cross-section. So the way that we've formatted the questionnaire, firms should be able to identify, for example, the number of Black females that have been promoted, the number of white males that have taken extended parental leave, the number of Spanish people that have left the firm. And this will give the firms much richer information and detail to check that actually they are fostering an inclusive environment for all of their staff. The reason that we've done this, excuse me, it's really reflecting on some of the barriers that have been identified in challenging managers in the past on why improvements not being met. So we have seen progress. Some firms have managed to increase their pipeline, but they're losing staff at a medium or senior management level. And often that can be because their policies in place are not inclusive. They don't allow staff, for example, who go on parental leave to re-enter the workforce and pick up, or it may be that there's issues within the promotion process. So we've really focused on all of these different areas to try and break down the barriers and try and get managers to think about the approach and what they're doing. Within the qualitative section, we split this across 5 key sections. The first is industry. So something that's often posed as a barrier, and something I mentioned earlier, is just a lack of awareness of the investment industry. So what are investment managers doing to create greater awareness through a wider pipeline of candidates? So are they, for example, working with different universities? Are they advertising these roles through different avenues? Are they looking at the assessment centres that they're using and the different socio-economic backgrounds of candidates coming through to ensure that there's a fair inherent process in place? Are they creating equal opportunities for their staff in having media representation or having the opportunity to speak at panels and things like that? One thing that I thought was quite interesting is some recent research was conducted into media representation and the press, and it found that 80% of quotes that are provided are from males. Now, on the surface, that doesn't seem like a significant thing, but something that sort of those that are on their own within industry say is actually seeing somebody that they can look up to, seeing that there's others the same as them represented, encourages them that it's a safe place to come into, it's an area where they're welcome and where they can thrive. So looking at some of these smaller details can help foster an inclusive industry where people feel welcome to come and apply. The second step on the questions is looking at recruitment. Recruitment is undoubtedly the highest barrier that's cited from asset managers on why progress isn't being made. And often or not, they'll say that a job advert has been put out, but there's just nobody that's been applying. I often don't hear how managers are then looking to work with different recruitment companies or looking at their process to see whether their job advert is approachable from people from different diverse backgrounds and welcoming, or how they're challenging the recruitment companies they're working with on how they're seeking to diversify the recruitment pool coming in. And so this really sort of identifies and looks at, you know, give us some information on the process you're using, and also looks at whether they use things such as quotas. Now, quotas and targets are often a hotly debated area, but I think in moderation they can be helpful. There was a really interesting piece of research that was done on panels, on interview panels. So if you have 4 candidates and 2 of them are male and 2 of them are female, the likelihood of any of those candidates being offered the job is equal. If you drop one of the females and you have 1 female and 3 males on that on the panel, then the likelihood of the female being appointed is 13%. It should, in theory, be 25%. Now, the reason this is the case comes down to something called sort of compliance and bias and not wanting to stand out from the crowd. So those that are making the hiring decision will be mindful of the others on the panel with them on making that decision. If they are picking the minority out of the group of finalists, then they are sticking their head out on the neck. And so they're more likely, if they're sort of a 50-50 or there isn't a big gap between candidates, to divert to the norm. And so understanding these biases and how you can put processes in place to eliminate them is really important to building up that pipeline, to build up representation and greater diverse systems. The third area that we look at is around culture, and this was an important area for us to focus on. It was really about trying to capture questions around inclusion, and this is a challenging area. And I will admit we may not have everything right in the questionnaire. We may need to look at this and add some more in, but it's really a developing area. But the way that we've looked around inclusion is around sort of the culture of the firm. So is the organisation reviewing the practices and programmes it's got in place to ensure that all of their employees feel included? Now, we know most workplaces carry out staff surveys, but do most workplaces look at the results of those staff surveys based on their diverse workforce, or are you taking the response rate as a whole? So for an example, if you're not using that data and information to look at that, you may have policies in place that you think are inclusive but are not. And there's a conversation I had with a female asset manager that really sticks in my mind, and even as a female myself, something that I hadn't thought about before I'd spoken to her. And she'd had a meeting with her manager. He said, "Oh, you're doing great progress. Love what you're doing, but you really need to make more of an effort to get to know the rest of the team." And she responded and said, "But you don't give me the opportunity to." And he said, "What do you mean? You get invited out every time we go out for drinks." And she said, "Yes, I do. You do invite me every time we go out for drinks. But what tends to happen is everybody waits around until the end of the day for you to come out of your office and say, 'Who wants to go for some drinks?'" She said, "I have 2 children at home." She said, "I don't have the luxury to just be able to, on a whim, say, 'Yes, I'll come along.' She said, I have to ensure that there's childcare in place before I can do that." She said, "So whilst you do ask me if I want to come to these events, you don't actually give me the opportunity to take part." And this is resonant in other areas as well, from events being alcohol focused or always taking place out of work hours and things like that. So this was an area we really felt was important to try and get firms to think about the policies they have in place, the reward programs they have in place, and how they're ensuring that all staff are included. And if you're looking at your employee questionnaire through these lenses of how do the females in the organisation feel, how do ethnic minorities feel, how are we meeting the various different needs? And it's not to say that each of these diverse groups are the same, not at all, It's just about using the information you've got available to actually challenge yourself as an organisation. Are we doing enough? And can actually maybe identify some of the reasons that you've got the pipeline building, but you're losing certain areas of the workforce. So this was an area that's got quite a lot of questions in, and something that was quite enjoyed with the consultants ourselves in trying to identify the questions. And actually from the feedback we had from the road test was the area that most of the managers came back and said these are areas that we hadn't even thought about before, and we're taking it back to our internal discussions on how we might use that. And that really, for me, is part of the hope of this charter and the questionnaire. It's not about sort of dictating this is the way it needs to be done. It's about opening up the conversation so that we move beyond talking about what the barriers are to how we're going to break them down. The next level on the qualitative section is on promotion. So this is about asking questions around how do the firms ensure that the promotion process they have in place is fair and equitable. Are they promoting people based on their skill sets and their performance, or are people being promoted based on who knows who, or whose face fits best? So it's really about sort of identifying and allowing the organisation the opportunity to explain the process, how they sort of ensure that that's fair and equitable. And then the final level is around board and leadership. And this is there, as I said previously, has been the most area of focus. And this is sort of an opportunity to explain any targets that firms have in place, the strategy, and the progress that they've made. And something that's quite a key focus among all of the answers to the questions is we ask for managers to detail the approach they've taken over the past 12 months. And this will hopefully alleviate us getting standard responses and allow us to see how each firm's developing and tackling their own challenges that they need to solve in their diversity and inclusion journey. Now, Andreas mentioned that we're in the process of sending this questionnaire out. So since we launched the charter in August, we've been working with various parties across the industry to try and help with standardisation and to help equip the asset owners in making an easier process to send this out. And we've partnered with 3 different RFP platforms, Camera Data, Diligence Vault and Invest RFP. All 3 have loaded the questionnaire onto their platform. Each one's got various different models on how they operate. So either the asset owner pays to access or the asset manager pays to put the data on their platform. But in this instance, agreement's been reached that the questionnaire will be freely accessible for all asset owners and all asset managers and consultants. And this is really great to see. It's great to see the collaboration taking place across the industry on this. And this will hopefully help lead to greater adoption, rollout and standardisation across the industry. Now, we've asked for asset managers to respond to us by the 31st of March this year. Once we receive the responses, they'll go to each individual signatory. That information can then be used to inform the ongoing manager monitoring. But the hope is also that we can pull this information together at an aggregate level so that we can have a look and actually get a clearer picture of what the industry is doing, what each jurisdiction is doing, where there's good progress. So look to include some good case studies there, but also identify where there are still barriers and maybe collectively or individually managers need to work on that. We've also been speaking with, we're keen to sort of grow the signatory base outside of the UK. So we're speaking with various asset owners in the US, across Europe and Australia, just sharing awareness of the questionnaire and the charter and looking for additional signatories. And also working with other industry bodies to try and continue standardisation. So in the process of sort of pulling together some groups where there's existing questionnaires such as ILPA and investment to try and share where is the commonality and where can further standardisation be made in the future. So that's sort of the main areas of the questionnaire. As I said, it's a really key component. It is quite extensive, and I do apologise if there are any asset managers on this call. But we will look to keep that as standardized as possible year on year. We'll take feedback from asset owners, managers, and industry experts on any additional changes that might need to be made, or improvements, I should say, so that we can wrap this on year. And over sort of the next 5 years, this will really give us the opportunity to see the progress. We can see year on year tracking of the information. My real hope is that it will equip asset owners to hold their managers to account, but also managers to actually reflect on where they are in their journey and progress, and the additional steps that they need to take to really seriously start trying to tackle the lack of diversity and inclusion within the industry. I'm going to finish with closing off on sort of just a couple of more reasons why I think this is really important. We quite often talk about themes individually. So climate change is undoubtedly, you know, it's been everywhere, all over the news. Everybody's talking about it, which is great to see. It's a key challenge for us to face. But we often talk about it in isolation, and it was really quite interesting, and I'm delighted to see that during COP26 last year, commitments being made by governments that investments that were being made to tackle climate change also included targets around greater gender. It also included amounts to tackle gender inequalities as well, because research has shown that without tackling gender inequality, we won't be able to challenge climate change. And recent reports that have come out around biodiversity and looking at the targets there have also linked the same. So it's great to see the interconnectivity of these targets, and my hope is that as the industry itself starts to understand itself, we will better engage with companies on this, but we'll also better understand the interconnectivity with these other themes, and just really the importance of doing better work in this area. So thank you for letting me come here today and talk to you about the Asset Owner Diversity Charter. All of the documents, the questionnaire itself, are available on the Diversity Project website. As I've mentioned, we work with the consultants who have all a group of 7 UK and global ones that have also all committed to roll out the questionnaire. So I look forward to seeing the response we get from managers later this year, and sharing the results of those in a report that we aim to publish in about 18 months' time. So thank you. I'll stop there and see, Andreas, whether we've had any questions.
We do have questions. Thank you very much. We also had something that was slightly unforeseen. We do actually have at least one journalist on the call. So I'm just wondering if the journalist wanted to follow up with you afterwards for an interview, would you be available for that?
Yes, no, that's fine.
Excellent. So in terms of questions, so everybody in the audience, feel free to either send questions to everyone or just to organizers. Both has already happened. I'll start with an overall question. How do you make sure that firms' quotas and targets are realistic? In particular, when we're talking executives rather than board.
I think it's down to sort of each individual firm to identify that. So obviously, if you have a firm that's already at 30% and they need a target of 33% versus one that's at 5%, the one at 5% has got a lot more work to do. So they do need to sort of be at an individual organisational level and their journey to identify. But if we come to, for example, the Hampton-Alexander review that set the 33%, the way that that was done was by actually reviewing and looking at where the industry was at the time, looking at the labour forces available, looking at the population makeup. So we know that there's 50-50 female male, so there shouldn't be any real need to question why there shouldn't be at a minimum a third represented on those boards. So it's about looking at the global, the local population makeup, where they are in their journey, and then sort of benchmarking within reason to others to ensure that those targets aren't too easy, but also not overstretching.
Okay, and would you make a difference between a board target and a top executive target, given that at a board level, the pipeline of potential female candidates is a lot broader than top executives within an organization?
So yeah, you would tend to have different targets for your board and your executive based on the makeup. You know, targets often it goes round in circles when we're talking about targets. Some people support them, some people don't. I would say that before we had the Hampton Alexander review come in and that explicit target of 33% set, progress was very slow. Once the target was introduced, there was something for everybody to aim towards. There's been engagement across government, shareholders and asset managers with companies on that 33% target. And last year that was reached and achieved. And I personally think without that, we may not have got there. It certainly increases the focus. And I think also we shouldn't get too hung up about if we don't reach them. We haven't seen that in the Parker review. That's for different reasons, and you know, there's not been enough effort there to do that. But if you set a target, at least it sets a strategy and direction. If you don't meet it, then you can reevaluate. Do we need to reset that? What were the reasons we didn't make it? So I'm personally in favour of them.
Okay, great. Then here's another question. What are your thoughts on the challenges surrounding the lack of reliable data on gender and ethnicity, and what steps can be taken to bridge any gap?
Oh, I'd love for there to be a reliable database. It's really quite difficult as an investor not having access to information to carry assessments and hold companies to account. We have that, as I've mentioned, more readily available at a board level. Executive is sparing. We have it for some, but not all firms. Anything below is more challenging, and even data on ethnicity is more woefully inadequate. So I would love to see a database form that was accessible. There are some challenges in doing that. So you've asked me what the challenges are. There is a lack of standardization across data. For example, when we look at categories used for ethnicity, within the UK, these tend to be focused on sort of census categories that are used. In the US, there's different categories that are used. So it's hard to get a standard that sort of works globally. There's also data protection issues. So within Europe, for example, some of the local countries have more stringent GDPR rules, and it's just not, companies are just not allowed legally to ask their employees for information beyond gender. In France, it's illegal to ask your staff for their ethnicity. So there are a number of challenges that are faced. And I think that it will take a while for some of this information to come through, but all we can do is try to work together in identifying these barriers and sort of push for greater standardization. As I mentioned, we're hoping once we've launched the charter and the questionnaire and we get some of that feedback and information, we'll have a greater awareness of just what some of these challenges are. Every manager's got the opportunity to report that back on why they can't provide the information, whether it's their own internal processing or whether it's legal or something else.
Yeah, we'll have a further point here. I think it's slightly more of a comment. PR writes just a slight 3%, almost unnoticeable, less favorable treatment of the female workforce adds up to derail well-deserved professional careers due to negative compounding. So I think statistically she's definitely right there. Of course, year-on-year compounding, maybe just a 97% chance rather than 100%, and adds up to a lot. Do you have a view on that, Helen?
So there is bias that still remains. And I think, as I've mentioned, a focus of the questionnaire is around inclusiveness of firms and creating a culture where workers are treated equally. And this sort of goes down to different policy levels as well. So I've sort of mentioned that in our previous discussion around sort of sort of maternity leave and paternity leave, a lot of family responsibilities tend to unfavourably fall on females. And this was evident during the pandemic. A lot of the sort of homeschooling work that took place, and the sort of cleaning and cooking responsibilities within a home do disproportionately tend to fall to females, and so this does create difficulties within the workforce. If you have an employer who's not so understanding of that, a lack of flexible work offering, and making adjustments and allowances for that, but also in terms of how companies are putting their policies into place. So something something that we ask within the questionnaire is not just about an organisation putting a policy in place that creates access for both males and females within an organisation. It's about also actively encourage take up. So if we look at paternity leave, for example, it's not just good enough equalising that for males. You also need to have discussions with your male colleagues and give them permission to use those policies that are in place. By doing that, if we have more males, for example, in the investment industry making use of that, you create opportunities for other individuals within the team. You reduce resentment towards females for taking maternity leave and being out for extended periods of time. And you create a normal base for people returning to the workforce to return into those existing roles and have equal opportunity to promotion. So yeah, I do agree that there is bias within that, but that's an area that we're working into the charter and having discussions with managers about.
Yeah, I'm the VP for Equality, Diversity, Inclusion in my college, and these male-on-male discussions can be very interesting, as you may imagine, on cases to raise awareness for the topic and get action. We have a user by the name of UK, and UK asks, how do you feel that gender equality will help in managing climate change effectively? Which I think there is a clear link personally, but how do you feel about it, Helen?
So there's a lot of reports that have gone into this, as I mentioned, fed into COP26, and we've seen the announcements by countries there towards tackling this. The reason it's important is, you know, if we look particularly to sort of less developed areas where a lot of the agricultural workforce to females, they're the ones that are undertaking the work and working in industries where we need to make changes to tackle climate change. And if we don't have their voice in the room and we're not speaking to them about the processes, then we're not looking at the potential opportunities or the potential impact of work that's going to take place around this. So I think it's vitally important that we have equal access of voice in the room and equal access of a voice to the solutions that are available. And you know, as the evidence points to, without it, our journey towards tackling climate change will be that much more difficult.
I think that's a very telling one. We have discussed in particular the aspect of ethnicity on our pre-call yesterday, and that it's academically, when we look at it, quite challenging to differentiate between various groups. And do you want to elaborate for the audience how you eventually decided on your starting ethnicity classification with the Charter? Yeah,
absolutely. This was an area we went round and round in circles on, and I hold my hands up. I don't think we've got it right just yet, and I think there'll be some way to go in to achieve that. But what we initially did was we'd used some of the information from the UK census and added in a couple of additional categories and sent that out on the road testing. And the responses we got back, it became evident that wouldn't work. As I've mentioned, there's different categories used in the UK, the US, Europe, and it's not even possible to sort of aggregate at a level to look at that, because some might put Chinese in with Asian. You've mentioned, obviously, on our discussion yesterday, the difference between Spanish and Hispanic, and they're all different everywhere. So what we decided to do in the end is eVestment have categorization that they use on a global level that have been used for quite some time now and quite well established, that asset managers in the investment industry have been responding to. So we decided to adopt the categorization that they're using, and we've implemented that into the Charter questionnaire. But we also have the option for other. So asset managers can respond and say, you know, these categories don't work for us. this is how we use it, and they can put that information in and provide the additional detail behind to explain how they're using it or where it comes from. So what we will do is, after the sort of full year has gone out, we've got information, we can reassess and take a look at that to see whether does this work the best for everybody, or do we need to make any changes. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge.
Helen, that sounds like a good start, I'd say, or a very good start to really a complex challenge. So I got the notice here that time is up. So thank you very much. I'll personally applaud for an excellent keynote.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before handing back to Scott, I'd like to ask the audience for one diversity consideration. I believe this event would like to be global and, of course, gender diverse. So I've just changed my name, Andreas Hopner-Dublin-he-him. So for whoever is interested, if you were to change your name, you just need to click on the dots and maybe put in your location so we can see how global the event is. I believe that multiple continents are registered, and your pronouns, I think that would be excellent for the diversity of the event, and also the moderators could easily moderate the questions. So thank you very much for me chairing the session, and Scott and Wendy, I'll hand back to you guys.